The city of Irvine, California, is one of the most valuable master-planned cities in America. The land beneath it was once a single private ranch of more than 100,000 acres, 185 square miles, almost a fifth of Orange County. Yet the city carries the name of the family that built it, and the Irvines have not owned a single acre in more than 30 years. How that happened runs through a university handed to the public for $1, a federal tax law that forced the whole ranch onto the auction block against the family's will, and a courtroom where the last Irvine heir fought the company that carried her own name over what the land was worth. Today, the whole of it answers to a single owner who holds no public shares and owes no one an account of what he owns. This is the story of how a barley ranch bought for pocket change in a drought became a city worth fighting over for a century, and of who paid for it. It begins on a coastal plain that Spain and then Mexico had carved into 3 great ranchos held by other families. Chapter 1. The land was already taken. Before the coastal plain of Southern California was American, it was Mexican, and before it was Mexican, it was Spanish. And in each of those centuries, the ground between the Pacific shore and the Santa Ana River belonged to someone. In the years of Mexican rule, the territory that would one day carry the Irvine name was divided among 3 great land grants, the ranchos that the governors of California handed to prominent families to hold and to graze. Their names still lie beneath the freeways and the business parks of Orange County, like the footings of a house long since torn down. Rancho Santiago de Santa Ana, Rancho San Joaquin, Rancho Lomas de Santiago. These were not farms in the sense the word would later carry in a place called Irvine. They were vast pastoral holdings on the open coastal plain, measured less in tidy acres than in the distance a rider could cross between dawn and dark, worked by cattle and by the hands of people whose names the land records seldom troubled to keep. The Californio families who held the grants lived by the herd. Their wealth was hide and tallow. Their account books were the cattle themselves, and their whole world rested on a single quiet assumption that the rain would arrive every winter and the grass would rise every spring, the way both always had. The 3 grants together reached across the flat country from the edge of the ocean inland toward the Santa Ana River and the mountains beyond it, a stretch of open grazing land that a later century would tally in the hundreds of thousands of acres. In the age of the ranchos, it was counted differently, in seasons and in cattle, and it was held the way a thing is held when no one alive can imagine it being taken away. That assumption was about to fail, and the families who lived by it had no reserve against the year it did. When the United States took California in the late 1840s, and statehood followed soon after, the ranchos passed under a new government, new courts and new taxes, and the old holders discovered that a grant written under one flag now had to be defended, at cost, under another. The land was already spoken for. What was about to change was not who owned it in name, but who could still afford to keep it. There is a question worth putting to anyone who grew up in Orange County, and it belongs at the beginning of this story rather than at its end. If that is you, take it before the film does. When a single family gathered 3 whole Mexican land grants into one holding, and then, a century later, handed a piece of that holding to the public for the price of a single dollar, was that a gift or a trap that took 100 years to close? Set the 2 readings side by side and say which way it leans for you, before the evidence arrives to argue for either. Because the man whose name the city would finally take did not clear this land, or settle it, or win it in any contest. He bought it, and he bought it at the lowest moment in the fortunes of the people who already held it, a San Francisco merchant arriving with money made elsewhere, at the exact hour the California world came apart. The thing that broke it was not an army and not a court. It was the weather. In the season that should have carried the herds through, the rain over Southern California did precisely what the entire cattle economy had assumed it never would. It did not come. Chapter 2. The Year the Cattle Died. The drought of 1863 and 1864 did to the California ranchers what no court and no army had managed. It ruined them. Across 2 rainless seasons, the grass failed on the coastal plain. The waterholes drew down to cracked mud, and the cattle that were the whole of a rancho's wealth died in the open by the thousands, until the great pastoral fortunes that had always counted their riches in livestock discovered that livestock could vanish in a single dry year. A herd was a bank. The drought closed the bank. Among the ruined was a man named José Andrés Sepúlveda, holder of the Rancho San Joaquin, one of the 3 grants on the plain. He was land rich and, by the end of the drought, cash poor and sinking in debt, and in 1864 he did the thing that desperate men with land and no money do. He sold. The buyer was a partnership of 3, and the price of 50,000 acres of the Rancho San Joaquin was $18,000. Not $18,000 for an acre, $18,000 for the whole of it. Land that a later century would value in the billions changed hands, in the worst year of a rancher's life, for the price of a comfortable house. One of the 3 buyers was a merchant named James Irvine. He had come to California not as a rancher, but as a man of the gold rush, one of the thousands who arrived in the 1850s and learned quickly that the reliable fortune in a gold rush lay not in the streams, but in the goods and provisions sold to the men who worked them. He made his money in San Francisco, in trade, and he was looking for somewhere durable to put it. His partners in the purchase were Benjamin and Thomas Flint and Llewellyn Bixby, sheep and cattle men out of the north. Between them, they had the capital the ruined Californios no longer did, and they spent it on the one thing the drought had made cheap across the whole of Southern California: land. 2 years later, in 1866, the same partnership reached for the grant beside it. The Rancho Lomas de Santiago, 47,000 acres of foothill and plain, came to them for $7,000. A second whole rancho added to the first for less than half of what the first had cost. With a purchased portion of the 3rd grant, the Rancho Santiago de Santa Ana, the partners had by then drawn together a single holding that ran to more than 100,000 acres. Piece by piece, in the aftermath of the disaster, the open range that had belonged to the old California was being gathered into something new under new names by men who had watched the drought from the safe distance of a counting house on San Francisco Bay. There is a version of this that is only weather and only commerce, an accident of the sky followed by willing sellers meeting willing buyers, and it is not a false version. It is only an incomplete one. The rain that failed to fall in 1864 fell instead, in effect, as money into the hands of the men who already had money, while the families who had held the plain for generations walked off the land and the merchant from the north walked onto it. The transfer was legal and orderly and quiet, and it moved 100,000 acres from the people the drought had broken to the men the drought had enriched. A partnership, though, is not an empire, and three men who buy land together do not always mean to hold it together. Within little more than a decade, one of the three would move to make the whole of it his own, and the ranch would meet the first real test of whether it could be held at all. Not against drought this time, but against the squatters who wanted to live on it, and against a railroad that wanted to drive its tracks straight through the middle of it. James Irvine did not intend to share. Chapter 3. The Ranch Against the Railroad. Buying the land had been the easy part. Holding it would take 30 years, a wall of lawyers, and a war against the most powerful corporation in the American West, and it began the moment James Irvine decided he would own the ranch alone. In 1878, he bought out his partners. For $150,000, he took the Flint and Bixby interests entirely, and the ranch that three men had assembled in the ruin of the drought passed into the hands of one. Consider the size of what he now held by himself. More than 100,000 acres, 185 square miles. 23 miles of unbroken ground from the Pacific Surf inland to the Santa Ana River. 3 former Mexican land grants welded into a single title. Almost a fifth of what would one day become an entire California county, owned outright by a man who had bought most of it from people the drought had ruined. A man could ride from the ocean to the river without once leaving his own land. In an age when the great American fortunes were being made in railroads and steel and oil, James Irvine had made his in the older and simpler form of wealth. He owned ground, and a great deal of it, and he owned it outright. Owning it and holding it, though, were not the same thing, and the years after the buyout were a long lesson in the difference. The first pressure came from below, from the squatters. Open California land drew settlers who believed, or chose to believe, that a title issued under a dead Mexican government left the ground fair for the taking, and they moved on to the edges of the ranch to farm and to stay. Irvine met them not with an army, but with the slower weapon of the law, and with fences, and with the patience of a man who could afford lawyers and time in equal measure. The ranch held its boundaries the way it would hold them for a century, by never once conceding that any part of them was open to question. The second pressure came from above, and it wore the most powerful name in the American West. The Southern Pacific Railroad, the octopus whose reach across California this channel has followed before, wanted what railroads always wanted: a right-of-way, a corridor of ground on which to lay its track, and it wanted that corridor across the Irvine Ranch. For most landholders in California, the arrival of the Southern Pacific was not a negotiation, but a notice. The railroad set the terms, the legislature was friendly, and the courts were slow and far away. A rancher who stood in the way of the track was generally a rancher who lost. James Irvine did not lose. He fought the Southern Pacific over its demand to cross his land, and he fought it from a position almost no other Californian enjoyed, as a single owner with clear title, deep pockets, and no partners to divide or frighten. Where the railroad was used to dealing with debtors and small men, it found on the Irvine Ranch a proprietor who could match it in lawyers and outlast it in time, and who regarded the 23 miles between the ocean and the river as his and not the corridor of anyone else's ambition. The fight was not quick and it was not clean, but the ranch remained whole, uncut by any right-of-way it had not chosen to grant. The pattern set in those years would define the place for 100 more. The Irvine Ranch was not merely large. It was undivided, defended, and singular, held against settlers from beneath and against the greatest corporation in the West from above, and held by one will rather than by many. Every later chapter of the story rests on this one. The city, the university, the fortune, the inheritance war, all of it was possible only because the land underneath had been kept in a single piece by a man who refused, on principle and at cost, to let any part of it go. By the time James Irvine had beaten back the squatters and faced down the railroad, the ranch had proven it could survive not just the weather, but the ambitions of other men. What it had not yet done was earn. More than 100,000 acres held for their own sake is a monument, not a business. And so the next thing the ranch became was not a fortress, but a farm. One of the largest and most productive agricultural operations in the American West, worked by hundreds of hands whose labor turned the defended ground into money, and whose names almost none of the records kept. Chapter 4. A kingdom run like a fiefdom. The land that had been defended now had to be worked, and for the better part of a century, the Irvine Ranch was one of the great agricultural operations in the American West. It ran cattle, as the Californios had before it, and it ran sheep for wool. But the crop that came to define the ground was barley, rolling out in pale acreage across the coastal plain from the foothills nearly to the sea. In its season, the ranch was a landscape of grain, harvested by crews that moved across holdings so large that a single farm elsewhere would have fit inside one of its fields with room to spare. The place did not feel like a farm. It felt like a small country that happened to grow things. And it was run like one. The owner set the terms and everyone else met them. The tenant farmers who leased parcels and gave the ranch a share of what they raised, the hands who followed the barley and the cattle through the year, the families who lived their whole lives inside the fences on wages and on sufferance. There was a single road, a company logic to the days, a rhythm set by harvest and by the will of the man whose name was on the deed. Nothing about it was cruel in the way the darker chapters of American land can be cruel. It was simply total. The ranch was a domain, and the people on it lived at the pleasure of its proprietor, in a kind of order that had more in common with an old European estate than with the small-holding democracy the American West liked to tell itself it was. It is worth holding those people in view, because the records barely did. The story that survives is the story of the owners, the purchase prices, and the acreages and the family names that would end up on freeway signs. The people who actually turned the defended ground into wealth, who cut the barley and worked the herds and raised children in ranch housing on land they would never own a foot of, left almost no trace in the account that came down. Their labor is the thing under every figure in this film. The warmth in this story belongs to them, to the vanished working world of the great ranch, the harvest crews and the payday and the single road out. The colder feeling belongs to the arrangement that owned them, and to the fact that the same fields that fed 1,000 families also made one family very rich. For decades, this was what the Irvine Ranch was, not a city, not a fortune in the modern sense, not yet a name that meant anything to anyone outside Orange County. It was grain and cattle and wool, a working empire of dirt, held whole and run tight, generating a steady agricultural income year upon year. It was, by the standards of what it would become, almost modest, a very large farm owned by a very private family. But a farm passes from father to son, and with each handoff, the question of who controls the land and how tightly grows more dangerous. James Irvine would not run the ranch forever. When it passed to his son, the ground would stay the same, but the thing that owned it was about to change its nature entirely. The land was about to stop being land at all and become, on a signed page in 1894, something that could be owned in shares, fought over in courtrooms, and one day taken from the very family that made it. Chapter 5. The Day the Land Stopped Being Land. James Irvine the Elder did not hold the ranch to the end of the century. Control passed to his son, James Irvine II, in 1886, and it was the son who made the single quiet decision that changed the nature of the whole inheritance. In 1894, he incorporated the family's land holdings as a business and gave it the plainest possible name, the Irvine Company. On that signed page, the ground itself did not move an inch. The barley still grew, the cattle still ranged, the fences still held the same 23 miles between the river and the sea. But the thing that owned the land had changed from a man into a corporation, and that change would outlast every person it touched. It is easy to pass over an incorporation as paperwork, and easy to miss what it actually did. A ranch owned by a man dies with the man, or is split among his children, or is sold to pay his debts. And most great American land fortunes came apart in exactly those ordinary ways, divided and diluted across generations until nothing of the original holding remained. A ranch owned by a company does not die. It has shares instead of heirs, a board instead of a will, and a legal life that continues no matter who lives or dies. By turning the land into the Irvine Company, the family did the one thing that could keep 100,000 acres from ever being broken up. They made the ranch immortal. Where a rival dynasty might scatter its holdings among a dozen grandchildren and watch the empire dissolve into ordinary estates, the Irvines had fashioned a vessel that could carry the whole of the ranch, intact, past any single death. The land would now pass not as inheritance, but as ownership of a company, and a company can be held by one hand as easily as by many. James Irvine II understood the value of what he had built, and he held it with a grip that lasted more than half a century. He inherited control in 1886, and he did not relinquish it until his death in 1947, 61 years at the head of a company that owned a fifth of a California county. Across those decades, the surrounding country filled in. Los Angeles swelled, the citrus groves spread, the roads multiplied, and the value of open land within reach of a growing Southern California climbed year upon year. The Irvine Company sat in the middle of it, undivided, patient, and closed, an enormous private holding waiting, though no one yet used the word, to be developed. That patience was itself a kind of power, and it points at the darker turn the story is about to take. A corporation built to keep land whole is also a corporation built to concentrate control, and control that can be concentrated can be captured. The same structure that protected the ranch from the ordinary death of great fortunes also made it something that could be locked away from the family that founded it, held by whoever held the shares, and defended against the Irvines themselves as fiercely as James Irvine the Elder had once defended it against the railroad. For now, in the confident decades on either side of 1900, none of that was visible. The Irvine Company was simply a very large, very private, very well-run agricultural business controlled by one man of the founding family, growing more valuable with every year it did nothing at all. The trap had not sprung. It had only been built, and the next hand to tighten the mechanism would do it in the name of protecting the family forever, by placing the company and the ranch and the future of the whole inheritance inside a foundation. Chapter 6. The Trap Inside the Gift. The family had already made the ranch immortal. Now it set out to make control of the ranch untouchable, and in reaching for that last measure of safety it built, without knowing it, the trap that would one day close on the Irvines themselves. In 1937, James Irvine II created the James Irvine Foundation and made it the controlling stockholder of the Irvine Company. On its face, it was philanthropy, a charitable foundation endowed with the family's own shares, its income aimed at good works across California. Underneath, it was something more useful to a man who wanted his empire to outlive him. By placing the controlling block of stock inside a foundation, instead of leaving it to be divided among heirs, he locked the company's control into an institution that could not die, could not easily be broken up, and could not be pried loose by a grandchild who simply wanted to sell and walk away. The ranch had been made immortal in 1894. In 1937, its control was made untouchable. For the family, this looked like protection, and for a long time it worked as protection. The foundation held the company held the land, and the land stayed whole through the middle of the 20th century while Southern California boomed around it. No heir could force a sale. No outside buyer could gather enough stock to seize control, because the stock that mattered was not for sale at any price. Los Angeles swelled, the freeways came, the orange groves gave way to tract housing, and through all of it, the Irvine Ranch sat undivided and closed, one of the last great private land holdings in a state paving itself over as fast as concrete could be poured. With every passing year, the arrangement grew more valuable and more rigid at once. The land appreciated as California filled in, the foundation's controlling block of stock became worth a fortune on paper, and yet none of that worth could be touched, sold, or divided by anyone the founder had meant to keep out. It was wealth held under glass, visible to the family and reachable by no one. But a lock that keeps enemies out also keeps the family in, and the foundation that shielded the Irvines from the world would in time shield the company from the Irvines. Control that sits inside an institution answers to whoever runs the institution, not to whoever carries the name. The trustees of a foundation are not the family. They are a board with duties of their own, and their loyalty runs to the institution and its charitable mission, not to the bloodline that endowed it. James Irvine II had built a fortress around the ranch. He had not asked what would happen when a member of his own family found herself standing on the wrong side of its walls. That question arrived sooner than anyone expected, and it arrived in the person of a young woman. When James Irvine II died in 1947, the long reign that had run unbroken since 1886 came to an end, and the ownership of the company settled into a new and uneasy shape. The foundation held control, a handful of relatives held minority stakes, and one of those minority stakes passed to a granddaughter who was, by every account that survives, precisely the sort of heir the careful machinery of the foundation had never been designed to contain. She held a minority of the stock and a clear majority of the will. She did not believe the men running her family's company had any right to run it without her, and she was not the kind of person to keep that opinion to herself. Her name was Joan Irvine. The fight she was about to begin would last the rest of her life, and it would end with the ranch in the hands of a man the family had not yet even met. Chapter 7. The Heir Who Would Not Obey. Joan Irvine came into her stake as a young woman, and she came into it at a disadvantage the founders of the foundation would have considered a feature rather than a flaw. She held a minority of the company's stock. Control sat with the foundation and its trustees, the professional men who ran the Irvine Company as an institution, and the arrangement assumed, as such arrangements always do, that a minority holder and a young female one in the middle of the 20th century would collect her share of the income and leave the governing to them. She would not. From early in her long involvement with the company, she made herself its most persistent internal adversary, the single-family voice that treated a minority stake not as a dividend to be enjoyed, but as a seat from which to fight. Where the trustees wanted a quiet holder, they got a shareholder who read the arrangements, questioned the decisions, and refused to accept that the men governing her family's land answered to no one named Irvine. For decades, she would be the friction inside the machine, the one member of the founding family who would not be managed, and the story of the ranch, from the 1940s onward, is in large part the story of what she did with that refusal. It is a genuinely divided story, and this is the moment to put the division to the people watching, because the rest of the film will pull hard in one direction, and it is worth marking the fork before it does. There are two ways to see Joan Irvine, and both are true. In the first, she is the heroine of this account, the one insider with the will to fight a faceless institution for control of a birthright, the dissenter who kept a family's claim alive against a board that would happily have run the company without a single Irvine in the room. In the second, she is an heiress litigating for decades over a fortune she did not build, born onto 100,000 acres that a merchant bought and a labor force worked, fighting other rich and powerful people over how the spoils of that land would be split. If you have a read on her, one way or the other, this is the place to leave it before the courtroom scenes arrive and tempt everyone toward the simpler version. Say which Joan Irvine you see. The film will argue in the end that she was both at once, and that the two readings do not cancel each other so much as sit uncomfortably side by side, the way they tend to whenever a principled fight and an enormous inheritance turn out to be the same fight. What is not in dispute is the effect she had. For the first years after 1947, the argument was internal and quiet, a matter of board meetings and family tension, the ordinary low-grade war between a controlling institution and a shareholder who would not sit down. But in 1961, that quiet argument produced something that would reshape the whole of Orange County, and it came, strangely, not from Joan Irvine fighting the company, but from Joan Irvine persuading it. She would push the Irvine Company to give a piece of its land away, 990 acres, handed to the state of California for a single dollar. It would be remembered ever after as an act of generosity. It was the most profitable decision the company ever made. Chapter 8. A Gift That Was Not a Gift. In 1961, the Irvine Company sold about 990 acres of its ranch to the University of California for $1, not $990, and not a discount off some larger figure. $1 for 990 acres of Southern California to seat a new university campus that would become the University of California, Irvine. A short time later, the company sold roughly 500 more acres nearby, cheaply, to round out the holding. And the person who pushed hardest inside the family for the $1 deal was Joan Irvine herself, the same combative shareholder who spent the rest of her life fighting the company, here bending it toward the most consequential thing it would ever do. Told one way, it is a story of pure philanthropy. A wealthy landholding family gives a nearly free gift of land so that a great public university can be built, and tens of thousands of students across the decades since have studied on ground the Irvines let go for the price of a cup of coffee. That version is real, and it is the version carved, in effect, into the name of the campus and the city around it. It is also, read against what happened next, radically incomplete, because a university does not sit on an island. A university is an anchor. It brings roads and housing and workers and students and shops and hospitals and the steady institutional permanence that makes raw land suddenly worth building on. And the Irvine Company did not give away the land around the 990 acres. It kept it. It owned, on every side of the new campus, tens of thousands of acres of grazing land that had been worth the price of pasture, and the moment a University of California campus was planted in the middle of it, that surrounding land began to turn into some of the most valuable real estate in the United States. The logic is not hard to reconstruct in hindsight, and it is offered here as analysis rather than as a line anyone signed. $1 spent to place a university on 990 acres was not $1 given away. It was $1 invested, and the return did not come from the campus. It came from everything the company still owned around it. The single most profitable act in the history of a company that would one day be worth many billions was the day it gave a piece of its land away for nothing, because that piece of land was the seed crystal, and the fortune grew out of the ground it made valuable. Consider what the gift set in motion: 990 acres deeded for $1, a public university rising on them, and around that university, held quietly in the company's name, a stretch of the old barley ranch that had cost, per acre, almost nothing in the drought a century before, now sitting at the center of a planned explosion of value that the company itself would design, build, and sell. The barley was gone. In its place, the company was about to grow the one crop that would outstrip everything the land had ever produced. It was going to grow a city. This is the hinge of the entire story. The moment the ranch stopped being land that produced things and became a machine that manufactured value, and it turned on an act universally remembered as generosity. There is no need to decide that the gift was cynical. Joan Irvine may well have wanted a great university for its own sake, and Southern California is unquestionably richer for having one. The point is narrower and harder. Whatever the motives, the effect of the $1 deal was to convert a defended, undivided, century-old landholding into the foundation of a private fortune of a scale the Irvines who bought and worked the ranch could never have imagined. The gift and the fortune were the same act. And once the company understood what it was holding, it did not hesitate. It hired planners, and it took out its maps, and it began to do something almost no private landowner in America had ever done at such a scale. It began to draw an entire city, street by street and village by village, on the land it still owned, and to build the place that would carry the family name long after the family was gone. Chapter 9. A City Drawn on a Table. Most American cities were not designed. They accreted. A crossroads became a town filled in around a mill or a harbor or a rail depot, and streets were laid where the traffic already ran, one decision at a time, by thousands of separate hands over a century or more. The city of Irvine was not built that way. It was drawn. Because a single company owned the whole of the ground, it could do what almost no landowner in America had ever been able to do. It could plan a city entire before a street existed, on a table, and then build the drawing. The Irvine Company brought in planners and laid the future out as a design. Villages arranged around the new university. Employment centers set apart from housing. parks and greenbelts and schools placed not where they happened to be needed, but where the plan said they should go. Wide roads engineered before the traffic they would carry. What had been barley became a master plan, and the master plan became, over the following decades, one of the largest planned communities ever built in the United States, a city of tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of residents living inside the boundaries of the old ranch, on a layout drawn by the company that owned every acre of it. And here is the mechanism the whole story has been building toward, stated plainly. The company did not make its fortune by selling the city. It made its fortune by owning everything the city made valuable, every road it laid, every village it opened, every parcel it developed raised the worth of every parcel it had not yet touched, and because the company held all of it, the rising tide lifted only one boat. The university had anchored the land. The plan multiplied it. The barley ranch bought for pocket change had become a self-appreciating engine, and the family that owned the engine grew richer with every phase it released. If the shape of this story is holding your attention, it is worth saying that it is the shape of nearly every video on this channel. A piece of American ground, a family that gathered power over it, and the long reckoning when the power outlives the thing it was built on. If that is the kind of history worth an hour of an evening, subscribe and stay with it, because the Irvine story is only half told, and the second half is where the family that drew the city loses it. For now, though, at the height of the plan, the Irvine Company looked untouchable. It owned a fifth of a booming California county outright. It was manufacturing a city and banking the appreciation. Its control was locked inside a foundation that no heir could crack and no rival could buy. The structure that James Irvine II had built in 1894 and sealed in 1937 had done exactly what it was meant to do, carrying a single undivided empire of land safely into the second half of the 20th century, richer than the men who founded it could ever have dreamed. The weakness was not in the land, or the plan, or the market. It was in the lockbox itself. The same foundation that made the company impregnable to heirs and buyers had one vulnerability none of the Irvines had thought to fear, because it did not come from a rival, or a drought, or a railroad. It came from Washington. A change in the tax code, written for reasons that had nothing to do with California land, was about to reach across the country and force the untouchable company onto the open market, against the will of the family, the foundation, and everyone who ran it. The fortress had been built to keep the ranch from ever being sold, and in 1969 the government of the United States passed a law that would require it to be sold anyway. Chapter 10. The Law Comes for the Ranch. The Tax Reform Act of 1969 was not written with the Irvine Ranch in mind. It was a broad federal law aimed at private foundations across the country and at the ways wealthy families used them to control operating businesses while shielding the profits from tax. Among its provisions was one that struck the Irvine arrangement at its literal foundation. The law sharply limited how much of a private business a private foundation was allowed to own. The James Irvine Foundation held a controlling stake in the Irvine Company. Under the new rules, it could not keep it. The foundation would have to divest, to sell down its control, and there was no path to compliance that did not end with the controlling block of the Irvine Company passing into other hands. The fortress had been built to make the ranch unsellable, and a change in the tax code made it sellable by force. Everything James Irvine II had constructed, the incorporation of 1894, the foundation of 1937, The whole architecture meant to hold the land in the family forever was undone not by a rival or a creditor or a drought, but by a single line in a federal statute passed 3,000 miles away for reasons that had nothing to do with California. The company that could not be bought was now going to be sold. The only questions left were who would buy it and for how much. The answer came in 1977, and it came as a bidding war between giants. On one side stood Mobil Oil, with the cash to swallow the Irvine Company whole and fold a fifth of Orange County into a petroleum balance sheet. On the other stood a consortium assembled to keep the prize away from an oil company, a group named for its principals, Taubman, Allen, and Irvine. Its members were among the richest men in America. A. Alfred Taubman, the shopping mall magnate; Donald Bren, a Southern California developer; Henry Ford II, of the automobile dynasty; Max Fisher, the financier; and, at the center of it, Joan Irvine, who did not fight the sale of her family's company so much as maneuver to stand on the winning side of it. The consortium bid $302.9 million. Mobil, weighing whether to raise, looked at the figure and withdrew, leaving the contest and calling the price economically infeasible. With the oil company gone, the Taubman, Allen, and Irvine group took the Irvine Company, and the sale closed at a figure near $334.7 million. The largest undivided landholding in Orange County, the manufactured city, the self-appreciating engine, all of it passed in a single transaction from the foundation that had guarded it for 40 years into the hands of a syndicate of billionaires who meant to develop it for profit. And Joan Irvine was one of them. She rolled her family stake into the winning group and came out an 11% partner in the new ownership. After decades as the internal dissenter, the minority voice the trustees could never quite master, she had done something almost no squeezed-out heir ever manages. She survived the forced sale of her family's empire, not as a casualty of it, but as an owner of it, a partner in the very consortium that now held the ranch. For a moment it must have looked like the end she had fought her whole life to reach. The foundation's grip was broken, the professional trustees were gone, and a living Irvine sat among the proprietors of the Irvine Company with a real stake and a real vote. It did not last, because the consortium that won the ranch in 1977 was not a union of equals with a common purpose. It was a temporary alliance of very rich men, and one of them wanted a great deal more than a share. Within a few years, the group began to come apart, its members bought out or moving on, and one partner moved steadily, patiently, and deliberately toward taking the whole of it for himself. He had entered in 1977 as one name among four. He intended to leave as the sole owner of one of the largest private fortunes in the United States. His name was Donald Bren. And the last person standing between him and outright ownership of the Irvine Company would be the one Irvine who had believed in 1977 that she had finally won. Chapter 11. The Partner Who Wanted It All. It had taken a syndicate of 4 billionaires to win the Irvine Ranch. It would take only one to own it. And from almost the moment the consortium formed, one of its members set out to be the last man standing. Donald Bren had come into the 1977 consortium as a developer, the member of the group who understood, better than the financiers and the industrialists beside him, exactly what the Irvine Ranch was. The others saw a landholding, an asset, a very large investment. Bren saw the thing this whole story has been circling, a private machine for turning planned development into appreciating value, an entire county-sized property owned outright by a single company, and he set about acquiring not a piece of that machine, but the whole of it He did it the way patient men take things, in stages, over years. He increased his share of the partnership, bought out the interests of the other principals as they chose to sell or were persuaded to, and moved from one voice among several toward the controlling voice. By 1983, he had become the majority owner of the Irvine Company. The consortium that had won the ranch as a group had, within 6 years, resolved into one man with a controlling grip and a set of remaining partners who now held their stakes at his sufferance rather than beside him as equals. Majority ownership was not the destination. It was a position from which to finish. A majority owner still has minority partners, and minority partners have rights and votes, and the ability to be an irritant to a man who would prefer to answer to no one. Bren set about doing to the remaining holders what the tax law had done to the foundation, converting their stakes into cash and their presence into absence, buying out the partners one after another until the ownership of one of the largest private fortunes in America narrowed toward a single name. Most of them took the money and went. The whole process would run to its conclusion in 1996, when Bren became the sole owner of the Irvine Company. But the last and hardest step toward that solitude did not come quietly, and it did not come cheap. It is worth pausing on how completely the wheel had turned. A century earlier, James Irvine had bought out his partners for $150,000 and made himself sole owner of a barley ranch. Now, another sole owner was buying out another set of partners on a scale 1,000 times larger to make himself master of the city that ranch had become. The structure the Irvines invented to keep the land in one piece had done its work perfectly. It had kept the empire whole and undivided all the way to the end. It was about to deliver that empire, entire, to someone who was not an Irvine at all. There was one holdout. Among the partners Bren moved to buy out was the one member of the old consortium who did not regard her stake as an investment to be liquidated at the majority owner's convenience, because to her it was not an investment. It was the family. Joan Irvine had spent her life fighting for a voice in the Irvine Company, had outlasted the foundation, had ridden the forced sale into an ownership stake when almost any other heir would have been wiped out, and she was not now going to hand her piece of the ranch to Donald Bren simply because he had decided he wanted all of it. When Bren came to buy her out, the two owners could not agree on the one thing the whole transaction turned on. They could not agree on what the land was worth. And because a fifth of Orange County is not a thing whose value anyone can wave away, that disagreement did not end in a handshake or a compromise. It went where disputes over enormous sums of money go. It went to court, and it stayed there for years, the last Irvine on one side and the company that carried her name on the other, fighting over the single question this entire film has been building toward. Not who owned the land. That was settled. The question was what it was worth. Chapter 12. Her name against her own. The dispute between Joan Irvine and Donald Bren was, on its surface, a technical one. When a majority owner buys out a minority partner, someone has to decide what the minority stake is worth, and in a privately held company with no public shares, there is no market price to point to, only appraisal, argument, and, if those fail, a judge. Bren offered a valuation for Joan Irvine's stake. She rejected it as far too low. He did not raise it to what she demanded. And with that, the buyout of the last Irvine became not a transaction, but a lawsuit, fought over the appraised value of a piece of one of the most valuable private companies in America. It was fought, of all places, in Michigan. The Irvine Company, for reasons of corporate convenience decades old, was incorporated there, And so the question of what a fifth of Orange County was worth came to be litigated 2,000 miles from the land itself, in the courts of a state that had nothing to do with California barley or Spanish land grants. The case did not resolve in a season. It ground on for years, appraisers against appraisers, the majority owner's number against the heiress's number, each side arguing over a valuation with hundreds of millions of dollars riding on the gap between them. This is the courtroom the cold open promised, the last Irvine sitting across a table from the company that carried her own name, fighting not for control of the ranch, which was gone, but for what her share of it was truly worth. The exact figures each side put forward belong to the record of the case and not to a documentary's confidence, and this film will not pretend to a precision it cannot source. What can be said cleanly is how it ended. In 1990, after a protracted battle with the majority shareholder, Joan Irvine severed her ties with the Irvine Company, and she left with $256 million, a sum she shared with her mother. The last member of the founding family walked away from the family company with a fortune and with nothing else. No stake, no seat, no claim on the land the Irvines had held for 126 years. $256 million is not a defeat by any ordinary measure, and it would be false to paint her exit as a ruin. But weigh it against what it bought and what it ended. It bought her out of the company her great-grandfather had founded, her family's name still bolted to the freeways and the university and the city, all of it now the property of a man she had fought and lost to. The barley ranch that changed hands in a drought for a few $1,000s had produced, in the end, a single check of $250 million to remove the last Irvine from the Irvine Company. She had spent her life fighting for a voice in it. The fight ended with the voice bought out and the company whole in other hands. And this is where the cold open's arithmetic closes. A ranch assembled for pocket change from ruined men. A university deeded for $1 that turned grazing land into a city. A federal tax law that pried the empire out of the family's protective lock and onto the open market, and a Michigan courtroom where the family's last fighter was finally, formally, and expensively separated from the thing her name was on. Each step was legal. Each step was, in its own frame, reasonable. And the sum of them was the quiet transfer of a fifth of an American county from the family that built it to a single man who finished buying out everyone else 6 years later. By 1996, that man owned all of it. And to understand what all of it actually means, the story has to leave the courtrooms and the family and look plainly at the thing itself, at the sheer scale of what one private individual came to hold when the fighting was over. Chapter 13. One Man's County. Consider what Donald Bren holds. Through the Irvine Company, privately and alone, he owns roughly 93,000 acres of Orange County, almost 1/5 of it, the surviving heart of the old ranch. On that land and beyond it, the company holds some 550 office buildings, 125 apartment complexes, and more than 40 shopping centers, an entire built environment of workplaces and homes and storefronts owned by a single proprietor. And the reach does not stop at California. The company holds a 97% stake in the MetLife building, one of the largest towers on the Manhattan skyline, rising above Grand Central Terminal 3,000 miles from the barley fields where the fortune began. Donald Bren is, by the reporting that tracks such things, the wealthiest real estate developer in the United States, with a net worth estimated in the range of $17 to $19 billion. The number matters less than its shape. This is not a public corporation with shareholders and quarterly disclosures and a board that answers to the market. It is one company, held by one man, reporting to no one. There are no public shares of the Irvine Company to buy. There is no obligation to reveal what it owns, what it earns, or what it plans. A person can live an entire life in the city of Irvine, working in one of the office towers, renting one of the apartments, shopping in one of the centers, and never once transact with anyone but the single private owner of the ground beneath all of it. What James Irvine II built to keep the land whole did not merely survive. It reached a purity the founders never imagined, an undivided empire of American ground answering to exactly one will. There is a dry irony in how faithfully the structure worked. Every safeguard the Irvines built to protect the family from losing the ranch functioned exactly as designed, and every one of them, in the end, served the man who took it from the family. The incorporation kept the land from being split. The foundation kept control from being scattered. The whole apparatus of permanence held the empire together across 130 years and 4 generations of pressure, and then delivered it, intact and undivided, into the hands of a single owner named Bren. The machine built to keep the ranch Irvine kept the ranch whole. It simply stopped caring, somewhere along the way, whether an Irvine was the one holding it. That is the reckoning at the center of this story, and it is worth stating without decoration. 100,000 acres bought from ruined men in a drought became a manufactured city, and a private fortune of some $17 billion, held by one individual with no partners and no disclosure, on land that a family lost in a courtroom and a labor force worked without ever owning a foot of. The scale is almost abstract until it is set against the small human facts underneath it. The drought-broken Californios, the barley crews, the tenant families, the last heiress bought out for $250 million and gone. But the land has one more chapter, and it is not entirely a dark one, because the same owner who consolidated the whole of the ranch also did something with a large part of it that no one in this story had ever done before. He gave more than half of it away, permanently, to no one. And that final act, generous and self-interested and lasting all at once, is where the empire finally comes to rest. Chapter 14. The Two Endings of the Land. In 2001, Donald Bren and the Irvine Company announced that more than 50,000 acres of the Irvine Ranch, over half of everything that remained, would be preserved permanently as open space, never to be developed. More than 40,000 of those acres were later designated a National Natural Landmark by the United States Department of the Interior, and in 2010 the company donated 20,000 acres outright to Orange County. The hills and canyons and coastal terraces that a barley baron had once defended against squatters, and that a developer had spent decades turning into value, would in their largest part now stay open ground forever, walked by hikers on land that no one would ever build on again. It is a genuinely large act, and it deserves to be counted honestly, which means counting it from both sides at once. Set against the arithmetic of the whole story, it is the gesture of a man who could afford it, a single owner permanently protecting land whose preservation also enhances the value and the setting of everything he still develops around it, and whose name is now attached to the conservation as firmly as it is to the towers. And set against the alternative, a fifth of Orange County paved end to end, it is a real and lasting gift to everyone who will ever stand on those preserved hills. Both readings are true. The land's second ending is neither pure philanthropy nor pure calculation. It is the same fusion of the two that has run through every chapter of this story, from a university sold for $1 to a ranch held whole for a century. One correction the record demands. The preserved acres are not Joan Irvine's doing. That conservation belongs to the Bren era of the company, announced and carried out after the family was gone from it, and it would be an easy and false tidiness to hand the heiress a green legacy on land she no longer owned. Her legacy runs elsewhere, and it is real. She spent decades as an activist and a philanthropist. She built the Irvine Museum around a collection of California plein-air painting that she later gave to the University of California, Irvine, the same campus her $1 deal had seated, and she was among the founders of the Children's Hospital of Orange County. She died in 2019, the last of the Irvines to have fought for the company, remembered for the museum, the hospital, and the university far more than for the ranch she lost. There is a beat here that belongs to the people watching, and it is the one worth the most. This whole story is told through owners because owners are who the records keep, the purchase prices and the acreages and the family names on the freeway signs. But the empire was built by people whose names the deeds never bothered to write down. The Californio hands, the Barley crews, the tenant families who lived their whole lives inside the fences on land they would never own. If you are descended from any of them, if your family worked the Irvine Ranch, or lived in its housing, or farmed its parcels on a lease, you hold a piece of this history that no title company recorded. Tell it. Put the names the deeds left out into the comments and say what your family remembers, because that is the part of this story the archives cannot supply and only you can. And if the work of putting the forgotten side of these American land empires back on the record is worth following, subscribe and stay with it. There is another one every week, which leaves the place itself and the paradox the whole film opened on. The city of Irvine goes on, hundreds of thousands of people living and working inside the boundaries of a ranch drawn on a table, in a place that carries a family's name on every sign and holds not 1 acre in that family's hands. The Irvines are gone from it. The workers who built it are unrecorded in it. One man owns the ground beneath all of it, and half the remaining wild land will stay open forever under his name. The barley is a century gone, the drought that started everything is a footnote, and the merchant who bought the ruined ranchos for the price of a house would not recognize the city that wears his name. The land outlasted all of them. It always does.